Okay, with the software installed, we're now going to look at installing the hardware itself. That's the DMX controller. We're also going to need some more cable. Obviously, that's the cable. Obviously, that'll go into your fixture. And that's for the extension of the actual DMX controller itself. So there's the cable. This is the fixture that we'll be using. I believe it's an 11 channel DMX Robo, whatever it is. I'll find out a bit later, but yeah, that's the fixture that we're going to be using. Okay, I'll be now going around the back of the computer to install the USB into one of the USB ports at the back of this computer. Okay, so yeah, here we are, sort of plugging the hardware DMX controller into the back of the computer. Okay, so I've just plugged that in, and we're going to need to make sure the driver's installed for this. At this point, we're going to open up the Freestyler itself there on the left, so double click on that, and this Freestyler software now opening.
The initial startup program Freestyler has no functionality until properly configured with your light fixtures.
Okay, that's the initial startup page in Freestyler. That's it. So I'm going to close that down again now. Closing that down. Are you sure you want to quit? Yes.
Let's take a look at the DMX light fixture that we will be using.
We're now wiring up the controller. I'm just going to put the DMX into the DMX in the back here. So that's the DMX cable in. Obviously, if you're wiring more out, there's the out and in, DMX out and in. Okay, we've just powered on and it's just reset itself. You notice down here we can set up the address for the addressing of the DMX. We've got this one set up to 208. Obviously, if you wanted to set the address up to a different address, you'd go into that and set it up for your addresses, but we go into that in a bit. So that's it plugged in, and we go back over to the computer. Okay, so we're now going to need to set up. So you come over to the setup menu here. If you can see my mouse there, setup. Freestyler setup, just there, click on that. And then we got like a virtual interface here. So that's like a virtual interface. The first thing you're going to need to do is set up the hardware that we just installed. So we know what we've just installed, which was the UDMX, that's the DMX 512. So we click on that to get the driver in, and this will come up. We want 512 channels because that's what it was, yeah, the Linux 512. So we click on the 5 channels there, that's okay. And we can click on save on that at this point. We just click on save at this point. Obviously you can go around it any other way, so I click save on that. Okay, so we come back into setup again, Freestyler setup there, and obviously that's still installed. But what we're going to do now is we want to control these DMX lights from a sequencer. So we're going to need to come over to the interface setup. When we come to the interface setup, we got the controller. When we click the controller, it's just saying it's a controller. So we come to external control, and we're going to use a MIDI keyboard for our MIDI controller. So we want to use a MIDI keyboard to be able to control the lights and to run it from a sequencer. So our MIDI control, and when you click MIDI control, you can come over here and see the inputs that you have. You see we have no inputs. Okay, so we're going to install our hardware. Whatever hardware you've got to use for your MIDI controller, you will have to use that. Okay, so I'm going to close this down now that I've explained that. So I just sort of cancel that and I just leave it there at this point. Okay, this is the MIDI controller that we'll be using to control the DMX. This is an old, old fossilized Birth 1, first generation. This is an Oxygen 49 key MIDI controller. Okay, this is what we'll be using to install as our controller. Okay, here we are at the back of the Audi MIDI controller, and you can see at the back we have USB. So we have a cable going into the USB for the MIDI connectivity, and that'll run into one of the MIDI ports into the back of the computer. Okay, so setting up your MIDI keyboard and the drivers will all be dependent upon your hardware. Obviously, if it's modern, it's very unlikely you'll get it to work, but this is first score, the beginning, the birth of Christ and all that. So yeah, that's the back of the controller, yeah, and we'll be setting up this MIDI keyboard to operate the DMX. Okay. Okay, I'm still trying to install a MIDI synthesizer here, so I think it was the cable there that was the problem, so see what happens on this one. It looks more stable. That's just plugged in, so it's recognised the device probably. Some of these things are just plug and play, you know, so I just make sure I've got some software installed on this that can play some music, so quickly go over to some software here. Make sure it's playing. Okay, it's playing in the computer itself. I'm going to the MIDI settings. As you see, there's my MIDI keyboard, the one that we're using, the USB 49. So just insert that into my installed ports on this. This is just for the synthesizer itself, setting up your MIDI synthesizer. So I just quickly go and press a few keys across on the keyboard to make sure it's playing. You should see the notes play as I press the keys.
Okay, it appears that we have the MIDI controller now installed.
Okay. So that's a MIDI synthesizer installed. Okay, so we're reopening Freestyler now, and we're going back into the setup. Freestyler setup, and we've already installed the driver. And we're coming over to the controller, so we're coming into the controller and we're looking at MIDI control. So when we come over to MIDI control, we select upon MIDI control, we get this menu come up, and on the input here where my mouse is, you always got to follow my mouse, we can see there's a USB oxygen there. So we're going to input a USB oxygen for the control of the DMX lights. Okay, the reason we're doing this is because we want to control our DMX lights from a sequencer, so we can put some music into a sequencer track and then we can program light shows to particular beats of music rather than just letting them do their own thing all over the place, crazy, shoot here, shoot there, go here, that. So we want some control over our lights, and we're going to get control over our lights by this MIDI control.
MIDI controller installed, so let's move on to part 3 of the tutorial. All my YouTube productions can be located by clicking into the link of my home channel. That's Practical Pete Forgot Reminder.